Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles, as we search the Scriptures, for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
We have announced this before we launch off into the study of Revelation chapter 6 and following. We're going to see some things that John mentions that, again, Gentile minds can run all over the place with the images. But Jesus used some of those images in his discussion with his disciples in the book of Matthew chapter 24, also in Mark chapter 13, but and it's also in the book of Luke, and we'll mention a couple things as we go along, but we are going to be looking primarily from Matthew chapter 24 as it applies to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Now, I want to make something clear. I've mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. There is a theory that is promoted that the second coming of Christ took place with the destruction of Jerusalem, and Jesus took the dead back to heaven, the resurrection, all that passed. And so some call it the AD 70 theory, and that or doctrine, and that kind of gets confused with what we're talking about. And I just want to make sure people understand that again, Jesus' return will be a visible one. In the book of Acts, the first chapter, when Jesus ascended into heaven, they were told that they would see this same Jesus come again in like manner. Paul tells us that in the final judgment, both in 1 Thessalonians, the 4th chapter, and 2 Thessalonians, the 1st chapter, that Jesus will appear in heaven with his mighty angels. The dead in Christ will rise first, and we which are alive and remain shall be called up together to meet them in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. And so those events have not taken place. And so a lot of times, like everything else, you talk about God's judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70, and then that gets confused with Jesus' second coming and judgment upon the world. And we're going to see in here that there are discussions of the sun and the moon and the stars are not going to shine and all of this. And Peter says the heavens will pass away with a great noise. It sounds like we're talking about the same thing, but in reality we're not. And to Gentile minds, and I keep saying this, we can run amok pretty quick imagining and envision some of these symbols that are again presented in the Old Testament. And the destruction of Jerusalem and the things have to do with Judea, Galilee, Samaria, Judea with the Romans, and we'll see that. And Jesus even makes it clear that these verses apply to them that are in Judea. How many here live in Judea? So what should we learn from that? It applies to those in Judea, and if we don't live in Judea, it's not something that we ought to be all that concerned with, although we have to understand it in order to understand the Scriptures. So as we come into Matthew 24 this morning, we kind of had a small introduction last Sunday, but we're going to begin looking at this more closely and encourage you to open your Bibles and take notes, rewatch the videos as we look at this. As we come into chapter 24, we remember that chapter 24 is not in Matthew's original writing. Matthew's original writing was in a scroll. He started writing and he finished writing, and while there may be paragraphs in the middle of that, all these chapter numbers and verses and all that were added many years later. And so preceding this, in the 23rd chapter, Jesus has been pronouncing a woe upon the religious leaders for their hypocrisy. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, and he gives various reasons why that is the case. Then he speaks concerning the city of Jerusalem, saying, "This generation shall not pass until the wrath of God would come upon the city of Jerusalem. All the evil done would be required of this generation." And so he was talking about the destruction of the city. He leads up to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the end of chapter 23, as you know. Look at verse 36. Go back to 23:36. Jesus says, "Verily I say unto you, truly." The word verily that's translated there is the same word as amen. If it's the front of a verse, it's translated verily or surely. If it's the end of the verse, it's usually translated amen or let it be so. And so Jesus says, "Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." Now, which generation was that? It would have had to have been, Jesus is going to be crucified shortly, and so we're at approximately AD 33 as we think of it. And so therefore it has to happen sometime. A generation normally is thought of about 40 years. And so in the span of about 40 years, these things, this generation will see that. And if we add 40 to 33, if my math is correct, that gets us to 73. And that will be about 3 years after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And so Jesus makes it clear that verse 38, "Your house is left unto you desolate." Desolate means no one else is going to inhabit it. It's the temple, which is the house of God, and these things shall be destroyed. And so, as we come into the 24th chapter, as Jesus went out, that is of the city, and departed from the temple, his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And as we said last week, there's perhaps lots of different reasons why, but I think, again, the beauty, the investment, the cost. The temple was 40 years in building. There's still some building work going on even at this time. And so his disciples want him to see. I mean, look how beautiful. You don't mean this too. I mean, yeah, over there where these mean people are that you're talking about, yeah, you mean there, but surely you don't mean this beautiful temple. I mean, look at this thing. I mean, this is an amazing thing. Look at it. And so Jesus clarifies, what they're inferring here, or in all of this, or trying to tell him. And Jesus said unto them, "See ye not all of these things? Now, and they're looking at the temple. So Jesus says, take a look at all these things. Well, all these things involve the temple, the buildings, the wall. Because they were going out of the city, they went through the wall, the gate of the city. Jesus said, take a look at all of it. Take a look at this. Verily again, surely, verily. When Jesus says that something is surely going to happen, how many times out of 100 does it happen? 100. 100%. You know, God said, I'll build the kingdom. He did. He'll send His church. He did. He was going to send a Messiah. He did. He prophesied all these things, and they came to pass. So Jesus says, verily I say unto you, you have a guarantee on this. There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And therefore that includes the temple. Now, when we read about the destruction of the temple, it's kind of interesting because some of the historians who write about this, Titus, the son of Vespasian, came as a military leader to finish what his father started for Nero. And Titus somewhat favored the temple, just like the disciples. The temple was, as we'd say here in West Virginia, is purty. You know, it was a pretty place. And so Titus had some kind of liking to it and preferred it. But when his men breached the temple and the city and eventually breached the temple, there was so much gold and silver that, again, they just kind of ran amok. And they set the temple on fire. And when they were burning the temple, much of the temple was gold plated or silver plated. What do you suppose happened to all that? It melted. Where did it go? And it went down through the cracks of the stones and places where there was a way. So if you knew that all this gold and silver had just ran down underneath that, what would you do? You go get it. And so you've got to tear things apart to get down in there. And so this ultimately brought about what Jesus was saying. Not one stone would be left upon the other, because the soldiers of Titus dismantled the temple looking for the silver, the gold, the valuable things. Bronze was in the temple, and so they were looking for some of that. Now, they did apparently carry away the menorah. There is on the Titus, or the Arch of Titus in Rome, a picture of the Romans carrying away the menorah. Now, we don't see the Ark of the Covenant. Nobody really knows what happened to it. But what Jesus said, I'll tell you, surely that the things that I'm telling you are going to come true, and not one stone is going to be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And that was fulfilled with the destruction of the temple and ultimately the final destruction of the city in AD 70. So he's going out of the gate, and he's going through the valley, and he's going to come up the hill over the top of Mount Olives, or the Mount Olivet, or the Mount of Olives. And that's where most of us see this image of what they call the Temple Mount today. Most of that is taken from Mount Olivet, or the Mount of Olives. And so Jesus had a tendency, if he wasn't going to stay in the city with someone, and he wasn't going to go far, it seems it was his custom to go up onto the Mount of Olives, and there was an olive orchard there. And so they would, in essence, sleep in the olive orchard. And so Jesus has come up, and he's up on the mount, and we're told as he sat upon the Mount of Olives The disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us when these things shall be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world. Now, they asked three distinctive questions in light of what Jesus said. Now, in Mark, the 13th chapter, the disciples that came to Jesus privately, we're told, is Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Now, Peter, James, John were part of what many call the inner circle. These are the ones that Jesus took on the Mount of Transfiguration. These are the ones Jesus took into a little further in as he prayed the night that he was betrayed. And so we have Peter, James, and John, the inner three, as some people speak of them, and Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother. And so there seems to be several different disciples, and the word here is again the disciples. Now that includes the rest of the 12, but there was probably more than that that were traveling with him, as we see throughout the scriptures. But these four sort of came to him privately. You know, they weren't asking for him to make some great public discourse here to explain all of this, but they privately said, Master, again, give us some insight into the things that you said over there about the city being destroyed and the temple being thrown down and all these things. Tell us when these things shall be. That's the first thing that they required. And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? So they ask about the destruction of Jerusalem. They ask about a sign of Jesus coming, and then about the end of the world. And so Jesus is going to address in this chapter, and Matthew records that, makes record of it, and therefore it was available to those to read and understand before the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. And so, beginning in verse 4, Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. Now this is an important thing that they ask him these three questions. And so Jesus begins by saying, if we're going to discuss this, let's discuss it so that you will not be deceived or misled by events concerning the coming in judgment on Jerusalem, or about the end of the world, or the sign of my coming. If we're going to do this, let's do it right so we don't get this mixed up. Don't let people get you all mixed up. And so he enters into this discussion with them so that they might fully understand the events that were going to take place. Now, because people jump with both feet in the middle of this chapter, don't have a lot of understanding, and I'm not saying that I am an expert of the Old Testament, but I have read and studied. Because they don't have a great deal, they take a lot of literal stuff and they jump right in the middle of this, and they go off in a million different directions. And you see that on radio and TV every day. You probably have people say, these are the last days. Jesus is going to come soon, because everything that they spoke about in the Bible is coming true day by day. And you say, what are you talking about? And they'll say, well, he told his disciples in Matthew chapter 24, and they go off into all of these things that we're about to talk about. Jesus said, don't let anybody deceive you about these things. Now, first of all, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's already made that clear. But when it comes to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, he's going to try to get them to understand, don't confuse that with the true second coming and the end of the world. Now, the language, it has a lot of like kind of sounds. Peter says that the heaven and earth that now is will pass away with a great noise. The elements will melt with fervent heat. The works therein shall be burned up. Paul speaks about Jesus coming. But one of the interesting things as we enter into this, I want you to think about this. Jesus told his disciples, as we're looking at this, don't let any man deceive you as to these things that I'm about to discuss with you. Right after Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4 talks about Jesus coming with the angels, the dead in Christ rising first, we which are alive and remain shall be called up together in the clouds to meet the Lord. So shall we ever be with the Lord. Paul says, wherefore comfort one another with these words. Now, if you go on down into the 5th chapter, if you forget all the chapters and verses for a minute and just read the letter, Paul talks about, but of that day and that hour, there's no reason, he says, for me to write, because in reference to that, he will come as a thief in the night. So Paul says it is a waste of my time and your time to try and figure out when Jesus is coming, when Jesus said, nobody going to know. And Paul says, I'm not even going to waste pen and paper other than to say of that day and that hour knows no one. And there's no reason to even write about that. Well, if that's the case, then if this is talking about the end of the world and all that, Matthew wasted time doing something that Paul said, I won't waste time doing. Mark wasted time doing things Paul said, I won't even waste time doing, because you can't do that. And Luke also, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three speak about these events. It's interesting, John doesn't. You have to think about that. Why would John not mention things about the destruction of Jerusalem that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote about when he was writing his gospel? Why wouldn't he include that in there? Could be because he'd already wrote the book of Revelation, and he'd spent a whole lot more time than all of them had on this. And so there was no reason for him to include that when the other three had already done that. So Jesus says, don't let people get you off track. And it's understanding, I'm sure Jesus understood that his disciples were troubled with what he's saying and what he's promising, because literally to them, it would be the end of their world. I mean, they would begin to think about, if the temple isn't here, and if the city is destroyed, the church started, even for Christians, the church started in Jerusalem, and the apostles, many of them stayed in Jerusalem. It was the base of their operation. If all that's destroyed, what's that going to look like? And so it would be easy for people to distract them. One of the first things he says in verse 5 is, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. One of the things that we read about during this period of time, which would be the early 60s on up to the destruction of Jerusalem and things leading up to that, the Jews, many of them had thought Jesus was going to be the answer that they were looking at, in the sense that he was going to amass an army and fight against Rome and throw the Romans out, and he was going to set up his kingdom on the throne of his father, and people were expecting that to take place. When it didn't, When it didn't, and many of the Jews did not embrace Jesus as the Messiah because he just didn't seem to fulfill what they were looking for, they put their trust in many others, and we'll look at some of that when we get over into the book of Revelation. But Jesus says one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be a rise in false messiahs. Now the purpose for this is that since Jesus didn't do what they wanted to do, people will try to do what the Jews were expecting them to do, and that is to rise up against Rome and go to war with Rome. And so candidates will basically show up establishing or trying to establish themselves as the Messiah to lead the children of Israel into that golden age that they've been looking for. And Jesus goes on to say, "Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." And the end of that is the end of Jerusalem, or the end of these prophecies. And he will tell us a little bit later when the end shall come. He does talk about the end when it talks about the end of Jerusalem, not the end of the world. Notice, and we'll look at this as we go into the book of Revelation, but I want you to see this here, that Jesus talked about this. There were going to be wars, skirmishes, battles between the Israelites and the Romans. There were going to be periods of time that the Romans were going to be coming into the land. They were going to be, again, fighting, skirmishes. All of this would begin to take place. And Jesus says, when you hear about the coming of these wars and skirmishes, battles that are taking place between the people of Israel and the Romans and whoever else Rome ultimately brings with them, he says, we're not there yet. This isn't the end. He, in essence, says this is just the beginning of troubles. And that's where we're going to launch off next in the next chapter of Revelation, in chapter 6. But you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. And all these things, Jesus said, must come to pass. There are events that will ultimately lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem and taking over the land and the punishment that Jesus is talking about. And all these things must take place. But that's not the end of all of these things. For nation shall rise up against nation, Israel will rise up against Rome, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places, or diverse places, or different places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. This is where we're going to launch off in Revelation chapter 6. At the beginning of the sorrows, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Everybody thinks that the four horses of the apocalypse are going to spell out the end of the world. But Jesus says that's no. The four horsemen of the apocalypse is not going to and does not spell out the end of the world. When you see pestilence, earthquakes, famines, and that's what the four horses of the apocalypse represent. Death and hell is there in the middle of it. We'll discuss that in more detail. But understand, Jesus said this is the beginning. So if you're going to talk about the beginning of sorrows, where would you start? With this. And that's exactly where the book, once we get through the introduction, chapter 1 of Revelation, Once we get through chapter 2 and chapter 3, which talk to the 7 churches saying, get your houses in order because I need you guys to be strong because there's some terrible things that are about to take place. And I need you guys to be ready to handle what's going to happen and take some leadership responsibility. Then we have that vision of chapter 4 and chapter 5. And once we get past that, chapter 6 starts the beginning. And Jesus says famine, earthquakes, pestilence, all this is, if you want to call it that, the beginning of sorrows. If you're looking for a time, how to mark this stuff out, here is the beginning of sorrows. You'll see many false messiahs come along, deceiving many, and you will see nation rise up against nation, which in this sense is Israel and Rome, and there will bring about famines and pestilence and all of these, and this is the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Right now, the church isn't even established. Jesus and what sometimes I call his band of merry little men, they really were still in the moving up to the cross and all this. The church isn't even there. You have to remember this. Don't jump ahead. Jesus is talking to people who haven't even seen the church come yet. They haven't seen the book of Acts yet. They haven't seen what's going to take place yet, even there plus. And so Jesus says that they, again, will deliver you up to be afflicted. The Apostle Paul was one of the first great persecutors, delivering up the people of God to be afflicted. That this great persecution, we're told in Acts 8 that when the persecution of Saul kicked in, they who were there in Jerusalem, the disciples, where many of them went everywhere preaching the gospel. And the reason that they fled, the reason that they ran, was because they were being delivered up into the synagogues. They were being scourged. They were being compelled to blaspheme. When they were put to death, people were giving their testimony against them. And the great testifier, if you want to call it that, the witness, was Saul of Tarsus. Now again, everybody's like, well, that's the Apostle Paul. No, it's Saul of Tarsus. He was a different man back then. And so he became a great champion of the cause, but did he do that by himself? No. He had to have letters from the chief priests and from the quote Sanhedrin, those who were in authority. You can't just go kick in a door at a synagogue and put people in chains and drag them out, and people are going to ask, by what authority do you do these things? And Paul, Saul of Tarsus, would say, I'm doing this by the authority of the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. I basically have a warrant for the arrest of anyone who is believing in Jesus Christ. And so they fled and they went everywhere trying to escape that. And even at again, in the process of his conversion, when Jesus sent Ananias to this one Saul of Tarsus, Ananias was, a man who was pretty much ready to argue with God. Not so. I've heard the things that this man does. You can't surely want me to go talk with him. And so his reputation preceded him. And the Bible doesn't, Luke does not go into great detail the atrocities that the Apostle Paul did, but Paul does testify some of that, compelling them to blaspheme. I mean, again, whether it's threatening their families, whether it was physical abuse, scourging, beating with rods, he kept on and kept on and kept on until he compelled them to blaspheme against the name of Christ. You'll be hated in all these places, the places that you're familiar with, the little world that you're a part of. You'll be hated. And as the church went out into all the world, when Saul of Tarsus became the Apostle Paul and they went out into all the world, we still see even Paul suffered persecution. He was stoned and left for dead. And Paul lists a lot of things. He was beaten 3 times, and we have that long list, receiving 39 stripes. He was beaten of rods, all these things. He was in prison. He was arrested, threatened. And so it's not a good time. But these are the things you want to know. So again, as all this escalates, understand that, again, these are the beginning of things, and we're going to escalate. It's going to get worse and worse. Matter of fact, in verse 10 it says, "And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." And that's in reference to the Christians. We see that there must have been a great deal of pressure being applied and attempting to influence the Hebrew Christians, because we have that book of Hebrews. The Hebrew Christians were being compelled, they were being encouraged, probably forced by some of their families, to come back to the Jewish fold. So we have one letter especially that talks about those who were departing, forsaking the assembling of themselves together. And again, we use that a lot of times about not attending church services, and that's true. We have to understand the original meaning of that is that they were literally forsaking the worship of the church and going back to the worship of the synagogue. Many Christians would be offended because of the things of Christ, the things that were going on, and the things that were being done. Many of them would hate one another. And so it'll be a very trying time for the church, because the enemies are within, the enemies are without, and Christians are intermixed between the Jews and the people at that time thought of Christianity as just another sect of Judaism. In the latter part of the book of Acts, the very last few verses of the book of Acts, when Paul was talking to some of the Jewish leaders concerning Christianity, and he wants to talk to them there at Rome, they use an interesting term. We've heard of this sect, this group. And so the Jewish leaders at Rome thought of Christianity as a sect, just like the Pharisees, just like the Sadducees, just like the Herodians, the Essenes, all of those. They just thought it was another sect among the Jews. And so since the Christians were dispersed in a mix of that, when Rome came looking for the Jews, Christians were in the mix. When the Jews come looking for Christians, they were in the mix. And so there were going to be a lot of issues that are going to take place. Anybody have any comments questions down through verse 10? Our time is pretty much up for today. Just finish up with verse 11 this morning, because this is something that we have looked at before. It says, "Many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many." And we studied about this in 1 John 2, verse 18 and 19, about the spirit of the Antichrist. Even at that time, there were many Antichrists. Many Antichrists had went out into the world. The whole book of Jude talks about the need of Christians to earnestly contend for the faith that was once delivered. And the reason for that is many false prophets had gone out into the world. That church that hadn't even been established yet, remember this. Jesus is telling the church is going to be established. You're going to be hated. A lot of people are going to turn away. And there'll even be false prophets rise up in this order of things. And so these are part of that beginning of troubles that indeed we're going to look at. So
why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.